Mike, we've got guests.
Hey, howdy. Dave and I have been moving out now that we've got this channel off the ground, and I found a DVD that I haven't seen in years. This is The Point. It's an animated film released in 1971 that no one's ever heard of, and honestly I prefer it that way. It's a cheap movie, popcorn flick, really just a vessel for a great soundtrack by Harry Nilsson. In the land of Point, everyone and everything has a point, as in a physical point on their heads and such, except for a boy named Oblio. Oblio is discriminated against by his peers, and eventually, because the law states that everything and everyone in the land of Point must have a point, Oblio is exiled to the Pointless Forest. There he discovers that the Pointless Forest is full of points, and in fact everything and everyone he meets on his journey has a point. Oblio returns to the land of Point with this knowledge and proclaims that like all things, even those in the Pointless Forest, he must have a point as well. The crowd cheers, the points on the people and on the town begin to melt away, and Oblio's hat is removed to reveal a point on his head. The literal theme of the movie is everything has a point, but how you interpret the word point might wholly change what that means. Your interpretation is informed by your context. If we were aliens visiting Earth, and our only source of information about Earth was this movie, we might infer that everything on the planet has some conical shape attached to it. But we're not, and that's not what this movie is about, of course. Because we have a linguistic context for the other meanings of the word point, and an understanding that the space alien reading would be absurd, we're able to understand that the movie is alluding to something else, because nothing exists in a vacuum. Context informs connotation, which in turn forms the theme, the worldview. This is all basic artistic analysis type stuff, but I find that the manipulation or outright refusal of context runs pretty rampant on the internet, especially right-wing YouTube.
Oh, I can see that.
Today I wanted to take a look at right-wing responses to left-wing responses to right-wing hot takes. A bit silly, I know. My intention was to find and dismantle the more in-depth arguments of online right-wing communities, rather than those of their chief propagandists like Sargon of Akkad, Black Pigeon Speaks, and Paul Joseph Watson.
Alright, while you get started, I'm going to take some of these out to the car.
Oh, sure, brilliant. It can be difficult to pick out and dissect the underlying arguments in any of these videos, because it's rare that these pundits actually engage with anything but the same well-scripted surface-level reactionary talking points about race, gender, sexuality, and economics. It's not until their supporters engage with critics that you start to see the actual reasoning behind any of these right-wing viewpoints. It's these smaller YouTubers who actually dig into the meat of the broader arguments that their pundits pose, and in doing so, reveal the core assumptions that drive their beliefs. I watched more than 30 of these right-wing responses, and selected a few of the more level-headed retorts to leftist YouTubers like Sean, H. Bomber Guy, and Three Arrows, all of whom I recommend. The core failing of every response is a lack of context, but in many cases that lack of context is a means by which alt-right views are propagated. This video will explore how the right omits context, intentionally or not, to propagate a hateful kind of ignorance among their base. I'd recommend you watch all these videos beforehand, just to ensure that I don't misrepresent anyone's arguments, but I also understand that this is about 7.5 hours of content, so I'll try to include all the relevant information I can today. And also keep in mind that some of these clips are laced with some pretty hateful rhetoric, so consider this your content warning. In 2017, Lauren Chen, also known as Roaming Millennial, made a video called People of Color, You Are Not Oppressed. In this video, Chen posits that systemic oppression no longer exists in the United States because there are no laws that discriminate against race. She contends that the large disparity in black incarcerations isn't a sign of oppression because these people were pulled through the justice system, which on paper does not discriminate.
Obviously, in the United States, there are no legal rights that a white person possesses that a non-white person does not, and there are no laws on the books that reference an individual's race in any way, right? I mean, our legal system, our entire system of government is not one that is racially coded.
Later that year, YouTuber Sean made a response video titled, A Response to Roaming Millennials, People of Color, You Are Not Oppressed, in which Sean rebuts that legality is only the paperwork, and that oppression runs deeper than law. Sean presents statistics that show the legal system often favors white people over black people, even when the charges are exactly the same. Regardless of how the laws are written on paper, decisions still come down to judges and juries, who may have their own prejudices.
On an individual level, controlling for all the factors except race, black men still get longer sentences than white men. And because they get longer sentences than white men, they will on average be in prison for longer, and therefore at least some part of their overrepresentation in the prison system is accounted for by this unfair sentencing. Any argument for this to be fair that mentions black people's increased relative likelihood of being criminals would have to therefore argue that individual black people deserve longer individual sentences relative to other races.
In 2018, Drew Diltum hosted a live stream called Watching Sean, in which he commented on Sean's response video in real time. Drew Diltum says that yes, there are people who discriminate, but the actions of those individuals, even if they are powerful individuals, do not constitute oppression because there is no societal entity actively bearing its weight on a group.
The state, or its parts that coerce by means of hard power, can surely oppress, but people using non-aggravated means such as exclusion or discrimination to direct people or society in some way is not oppression. For instance, in the private sector, if I don't want to do business with a black guy because he's black, you may think this is horrible for whatever reason, and maybe it is, but it's surely not oppressive, contrary to what many people on the left might think.
This is, frankly speaking, false. Oppression is the unjust use of power. If we believe that discrimination based on race is unjust, which Drew Diltum gives a resounding maybe on, and a business owner has the power to decide whom their business serves, then that is oppression. Drawing an arbitrary line between the power of the state and the power exerted by individuals in that state turns that state into an immutable abstract that those in power can essentially hide behind.
Why, isn't there any other way?
The law is the law, King. You cannot fight that.
The law is the law. I never looked at it quite like that.
Diltum also counters Sean's statistics about the legal system's bias. He contends that, statistically, black people receive longer sentences because they either are more likely to have been carrying a weapon at the time of the crime, or because they are more likely to have served time once before. The statistics he poses are factual, but neither Diltum nor Roaming Millennial attempt to speculate why black people might be more likely to commit a crime in the first place, why black people might be more likely to carry a weapon at any given time, or why they are consistently more likely to be arrested rather than let off with a warning. The real answer to why a black person is more likely to commit a crime is, of course, rooted in systemic poverty, poverty that finds its roots in slavery and discrimination and is currently upheld by racial oppression. But because neither Dilton nor Roaming Millennial believe that oppression exists, they have to chalk it up to an inherent racial difference. But they can't say that out loud, can they? Halfway through the video, Sean asks why black people commit more crimes. Drew Diltum interjects to say this.
One doesn't have to give an answer to, explain why the disparity exists. But if we control for all variables and the only one left that can predict these differences is race, then the cause of these differences is probably racial.
And it's not clear whether he's speaking in hypotheticals at this point, but it doesn't really matter. His point has been made. A study that Diltum uses to write off race as a non-issue is Racial Disparity in Federal Criminal Statistics, published by the University of Michigan, which argues that race is likely not the sole agent of correlation. Instead, the study posits it's things like socioeconomic status and high school dropout rates that are more closely aligned to criminality. The study is correct in asserting this, but again, Diltum leaves it at that. He gets a point for displacing some of the blame from the judicial process that Sean assigns, but he doesn't take the necessary next step to consider whether, or why for that matter, race is so closely tied to socioeconomic status and high school dropout rates in the first place. Ultimately, Diltum makes the same mistake as many other right-wing YouTubers by hopping off the deduction train as early as possible and trying to avoid letting context get in the way of their worldview. Diltum presents a New York Times report that shows white people are both more likely to remain rich and rise to wealth than black people, and that black people are more likely to fall into poverty from wealth and remain in poverty than white people. And with no explanation or discussion of what might be causing that disparity, Diltum closes the study with this.
the sons of black families from the top 1% had about the same chance of being incarcerated on a given day as the sons of white families earning $36,000, which is about $20,000 below the average for Americans. And you can see how this trend maintains itself. So that is pretty much the whole point here. And is there any other data here? Anyway, I think we get the point.
I hope the irony is not lost on you. In a video by Sean called Source Check, the XY Einzelfall map, Sean looks at a since deactivated Facebook group that supposedly documented and mapped every case of migrant crime in Germany in 2016. Sean points out that not only are there duplicates of reports on this map, but many of the reports are simply, well, reports. Any suspect of a crime who was described by witnesses as non-white was placed on this map, regardless of whether their immigrant status was actually known. And most hilariously, Sean walks through every case of reported arson and exposes most of them as simple cooking fires.
A cooking fire, a cooking fire, a cooking fire, another cooking fire, another cooking fire, firecrackers set off a fire alarm accidentally, a cooking fire.
Sean concludes that the map wildly misrepresents migrant crime, likely in order to perpetuate anti-immigrant sentiment.
This map is silly. It is not a list of confirmed migrant and refugee crimes. It is ridiculous and unscientific moral panic. It's bigotry, anti-immigrant sentiment, and anti-Islamic racism.
One YouTuber who had previously used the map to peddle such anti-immigrant sentiments was KrautNT, who later watched Sean's video and attempted to rebut it. The crux of Kraut's video response, called Legalizing Arson with Sean, is the assertion that Sean is wrong to not consider cooking fires to be arson. According to German law, Kraut points out, cooking fires are considered criminally negligent arson, and therefore deserve to be posted on the map as crimes.
Cause a fire through your stupidity or carelessness, and people get injured or even killed. And I actually went to a real law faculty at my university and asked in the law library and was told that this would then fall under the section of death through criminal negligence under paragraph 222, punishable with up to 5 years in prison, and bodily harm through criminal negligence under paragraph 229, punishable with up to 3 years in prison.
And technically, he's right to say that cooking fires are legally arson, but what's his point? Kraut's anti-immigrant argument depends on his viewers not making the very distinction that Sean does, that cooking fires are materially different from malicious and deliberate arson, regardless of whether they fall into the same legal category. Aside from the obvious concern that relying on laws as one's own framework for moral judgment ignores the history of discriminatory laws and the susceptibility of the legal system to capitalism, which actively often seeks to undermine the personal liberties of most people, the stubborn refusal to dive any deeper than arson is baffling.
The law is the law.
Effectively, Kraut is saying that because they can be referred to by a broader title, using specific language is somehow missing the point. By the same reasoning, we might as well teach preschoolers the word thing and then give everyone the rest of the day off.
But if that kind of reasoning is so obviously absurd, what does Kraut have to gain by asking his viewers to adopt it anyway?
Well, by insisting that cooking fires be called arson, Kraut is asking you to pin the connotation associated with arsonists onto people in homes that just suffer kitchen fires. This is very convenient, given that immigrants are a lot more likely to live in cheaper, low-quality housing where faulty appliances and non-compliance with fire code contribute to a higher rate of such accidental fires.
Like the Grenfell Tower.
Exactly. So even if
the law is the law,
Kraut intends to use the connotations behind the word arson to paint immigrants as disproportionately dangerous. That's his point.
I think it's worth pointing out that many of the points that we've made have also been made in a since-removed response to the response by Sean himself. The video was since unlisted on the grounds that some of its content reflects some at the time, toxic YouTube drama, and out of respect for his wishes, I'll leave the specifics of that video out of this. But I have to say, I think there's value in keeping these specific criticisms public so long as Kraut's video remains on YouTube.
I agree. By the way, I finished taking the furniture out to the car. Do you mind packing up some of the dishes?
Oh yeah, sure.
I'll take the next one.
Cheers.
In 2017, H-Bomber Guy made a 2-part video series called Measured Response: Bill Nye vs. Pseudoscience, in which H-Bomber Guy debunks a number of YouTubers who try to criticize Bill Nye for explaining that sex, gender, sexual preference, and gender expression all exist on separate spectrums.
It's very quick to check, and the studies that result from checking are very informative and interesting, and challenge the idea that gender expression is made up and equivalent to just trying to be fashionable.
The next year, Zarathustra's Serpent posted a video on the YouTube channel The Thinkery called H-Bomber Guy: An Unmeasured Response. In the video, Zarathustra actually agrees with the science Bill Nye presents, but paints an inaccurate picture of modern social justice movements that's reflected often in the talking points of the right. Firstly, Zarathustra claims that the social justice movements believe gender and gender expression have nothing to do with biology.
So what is the picture that the social justice movement is trying to impose? Well, first of all, they are exploiting the fact that science says that there isn't a perfect correlation between sex, gender, and expression, and twist it to deceive uninformed people into thinking that there is no correlation at all. And, once they make them believe that gender identity isn't correlated with biology, they establish the idea that it is completely a social construct.
This claim is false, but it's a popular straw man used to avoid contending with the real argument, which is that biological sex should not automatically, legally presume one's gender. Models like the popular genderbread person explicitly acknowledge anatomical sex as a component of gender. Not the whole thing, but part of it. By and large, social justice movements don't claim that gender and biological sex are unrelated, but they do believe that the extent to which they're perceived to be tied is exaggerated in today's patriarchal, heteronormative society. Society discourages and strips legal rights from those who don't adhere to gender norms, and gender norms are being wielded as a weapon of oppression by those in power in both the workplace and the political sphere. Some recent examples might include the open hostility towards Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, any debate about bathroom bills, and the tedium involved in legally changing one's gender versus changing one's name. The claim that gender is independent of biological sex is a straw man, and it's an unfortunately common one. It's a false context that the right applies to progressive arguments, and that false context taints everything that comes after. This problem is exacerbated when Zarathustra displaces his frustration with the apparent wealth of gender identities onto a couple of smaller, non-binary YouTubers, many of whom openly discuss their experiences with gender and gender expression and acknowledge that they're still growing and learning about themselves. Zarathustra sees the desire to give a label to one's specific gender experience as being selfish and detrimental towards the use of more widely applicable labels like male, female, and non-binary. Zarathustra posits that to use a word like gender fluid actively belittles and undermines those more pervasive terms and therefore the English language as a whole.
If we add more gender identities to our language, we will be labeling people against their will. These kids may think that this identity that they create belongs only to them, but that's not how the human mind works. The logic that turns every identity into a category that includes several items is part of our nature, and is not something that we can avoid.
I think the core failing of Zarathustra's argument is assuming that language is a kind of zero-sum game in which the existence and use of more specific words actively saps power and utility from the broader categories they fall under. Assuming the English language is one entity that can be tainted is misguided, and often that assumption is the beginning of a discriminatory slippery slope that leads to enforcing things like proper English and quote-unquote lesser dialects spoken by the poor or minorities. Labels and categories are just a tool in the toolbox of identity, and if people want to use labels to identify themselves, that's fine and in many cases useful. However, it's important to know that these same tools are being used to oppress non-cisgender people. It's not the categories that LGBTQ activists want to tear down. It's the use of involuntary categories by lawmakers and bigots in power to strip away their fundamental human rights. A strikingly obvious example is the White House's expressed interest in legally defining gender based on genitalia at birth, and the recent ban on transgender people serving in the American military. Categories and labels should be opt-in, and in a time when oppressed groups are seeking community, labels can be an effective way to communicate and support one another in the face of adversity. In a similar sense, people's desires to escape traditional pronouns aren't founded on the idea that the word he or she is inherently sexist, but rather that the connotations that come with those words don't accurately describe them. The right see the desire to change pronouns as nonsensical and narcissistic, but even if you believe that's the case, what harm is it doing? I mean, no one led protests when Prince wanted to change his name to, well, this. Further discussion of self-identification is best left to the many eloquent trans and non-binary YouTubers, but the long and short of it is that you probably shouldn't judge someone's actions if you don't understand the context, that is, their personal experience. The reactionary right seem to believe that these feminists, LGBTQ activists, and racial equality activists are simply coming out of the woodwork to claim they're oppressed and collect some form of compensation. To the right, when LGBTQ activists say they want to dismantle gender norms, they see a rejection of biology, rather than a desire to be rid of the aspects of gender that contribute to an oppressive society. These communities on the right don't seem to understand that progressive movements are responding to injustices, and so the right doesn't take the context of those injustices into account when they listen to those movements. Zarathustra makes this mistake throughout the video when describing LGBTQ movements, and it undermines his credibility as a result. Zarathustra and others strip the context away from these arguments, usually to nitpick their semantics once they've reframed the arguments in their favor. In 2018, Three Arrows made a video called How Cultural Marxism Became the Far-Right Scapegoat, in which Three Arrows outlines the relationship between the Nazi propagandist anti-Semitic term cultural Bolshevism and the modern right-wing term cultural Marxism.
Cultural Marxism is nothing but a conspiracy theory rooted in anti-Semitism and propagated by people who fail to understand certain changes in culture they dislike.
The next month, Endeavor made a response video called Response to Three Arrows on Cultural Marxism, claiming that cultural Marxism isn't a conspiracy theory, but rather an ideology that's being used by the left to undermine Western culture. Three Arrows defines cultural Marxism as a conspiracy theory that posits Marxists are infiltrating Western culture with things like feminism and diversity in order to destroy it. Endeavor disagrees, and instead classifies cultural Marxism as a separate phenomenon.
Everyone seems to have a different definition on this, but the general consensus seems to be that there is a certain group of people, namely Marxists, who try to influence Western culture in a certain way to ultimately bring down Western civilization, which they view as oppressive.
Endeavor defines cultural Marxism as the application of a Marxist oppressor versus oppressed narrative to cultural groups rather than economic groups.
This is what people generally refer to when they say cultural Marxism. It's the idea of applying the oppressor versus the oppressed narrative to culture rather than class, as in traditional Marxism.
This is itself pretty ridiculous. Simply claiming a conflict exists is no more attributable to Marx than rhyming is to Dr. Seuss. It does, however, exploit a cultural fear of communism to villainize a long extant field that already has a name: critical theory. Under the umbrella of critical theory are studies like feminist theory and race theory, which look at historical power structures between marginalized groups and their oppressors. Because the term critical theory exists and is well established, the term cultural Marxism must be meant to imply something else, something that isn't conveyed if you were to use the term critical theory. This is why the term has been identified as anti-Semitic and conspiratorial, because the use of a term rooted in anti-Semitism in active defiance of a more neutral term like critical theory implies that the person using the term suspects there's something else going on. Probably at the hands of the Jews, honestly. It's worth noting that Marx himself was Jewish, and his name has been used as an anti-Semitic dog whistle for more than a century. The phrase cultural Marxism intentionally frames critical theory around Marx, but if you don't have the historical context to know the relationship between cultural Bolshevism and cultural Marxism, it seems like a wholly innocent term. Endeavor makes a quick detour to say that Bolshevism and Maoism both replaced good art with lesser art, referring to the Artists' Union of the USSR and Mao's Cultural Revolution respectively, in what seems like an attempt to draw parallels between these revolutions inspired by Lenin's interpretation of Marx and Hitler's Entartet Kunst, or degenerate art campaign against modernism. He also claims to see this trend reflected in today's modern art. What he doesn't point out is that the suppression of some art under Bolshevism and Maoism was imposed by the state, and the art that replaced it was largely propaganda created, paid for, and regulated by the state. That's obviously not what's happening with today's modern art, but Endeavor's parallel asserts as much, in another case of these arguments implying a sort of conspiracy. As an aside, I think the more apt parallel here is how the American government funds Hollywood blockbusters that portray the US and the military in a positive light. Movies like Michael Bay's Transformers and Zack Snyder's Man of Steel are, in part, government-funded, specifically because they support the state. It's the carrot rather than the stick, but it's propaganda nonetheless. Anyway, Endeavor later posits that the fault in cultural Marxism, or critical theory, is that those who use critical theory attribute the disparity between men and women exclusively to oppression and not to a fundamental biological difference.
When someone says cultural Marxism, they are referring to the oppressor versus oppressed narrative being applied to things like race, gender, or culture, rather than economic class. For example, when asked why men take up the leadership roles of society, feminists would say it's because men oppressed women, rather than saying it's because there's a fundamental difference between the genders.
Essentially, Endeavor believes critical theory is a scapegoat used to propagate the idea of the blank slate and, no surprises here, to reject biology. He is of course wrong, but based on this claim, he asserts that this is what leads leftists to believe there must be some oppressive agent causing disparities between races and genders. For some reason, no matter how you slice it, it always comes down to the right accusing the left of ignoring biology.
It's the same mistake as earlier, but this time it's in conjunction with an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Who knew?
In 2016, the Alternative Hypothesis made a video called White America, in which they speculated about what America might look like if all of a sudden there were only white people. The video pulls out some baffling statistics and, in a lot of cases, just assumes that people of color somehow vanished without their labor, present and historical, going anywhere. It becomes clear that the point of this video is to posit that America would be a better country if people of color didn't live in it. Later that year, Sean included a since unlisted response in a sort of grab bag type video. He rather quickly calls it out for the racist propaganda that it is, of course emphasizing that America was built on the backs of slaves and that racial disparities in crime and wealth are a result of systemic racial oppression, not genetics. He has this to say.
The only reason to make this video is to further a white nationalist narrative without admitting to it.
The next day, the Alternative Hypothesis released their own response called Pseudo-Response to Sean and Jen's Non-Response, in which the Alternative Hypothesis speaks rather off the cuff about the nature of both their video and Sean's.
The Alternative Hypothesis calls out Sean for questioning the logistics of this magical disappearance of non-white people, and instead posits it was simply a thought experiment. He reframes this as, observations come first.
I wasn't talking about this in real terms. I was just sort of, observations come first. Let's look at the effects here in a sort of disintegrated way of white people.
And I promise, we get the premise. It's clear where the calculations for his speculations come from, but it's also clear that even if it was done unintentionally, they pull the numbers out of their context to frame minorities as a hindrance to society.
What White America video was, it was a video that wasn't about policy, it was a video about priors. Okay, because when you go in and you have a policy discussion, there's a whole lot of prior beliefs that go into that policy discussion. And what Sean is doing, and why he made such an error in understanding what my video was about, or what our video was about, is he's operating at the level of policy, where that video is operating at the sort of goes-intos of beliefs that inform policy.
The video implies policy by nature of its existing, you see. The text of the piece lacks an overt discussion of policy, but the theme of the text broadcasts the intention clear as day. Get the non-whites out of America, and America will be better. You can't divorce that sentiment from a video about how much better America would be without people of color.
The alternative hypothesis and so many other YouTubers use this "I'm just saying" attitude as plausible deniability when they're in fact making racist and sexist assertions. It doesn't take a lot of work to see through it, but once you call it out, they'll blame you for reaching a conclusion.
Its observations come first. You know, who needs context?
Just because you're saying one thing doesn't mean you're not implying something else. Just because you don't mean to imply that thing doesn't mean you didn't. And just because it's not your agenda doesn't mean you're not pushing someone else's.
You can't write a story without a theme. You can't present a carefully curated set of data with a voiceover and image slideshows without implying a theme either. You can't throw away context and expect the course of action to be practical.
Everything has a point.
Thanks so much for watching.
See you next time.
This program was brought to you by viewers like you. Go to patreon.com/neighborhood_MD to become a sponsor of our program. For more updates and content, follow The Neighborhood on Twitter and watch our weekly stream every Friday on Twitch. Thank you for watching.